Chapter, excuse me again, chapter 14 is entitled The Origin of Species. All right. So in this chapter, we're just going to talk about how species are formed. Remember what a biological species is. It's a population or a group of populations of the same group of individuals whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce fertile or viable offspring, right? Generally, we think of species as a particular kind of thing, right? It's a kind of bird, it's a kind of fish. Taxonomy is the science of identifying, naming, and classifying organisms, right? I'll talk about it at the end of chapter 15. So, genetic divergence, all right? This is the way most species are formed. Okay, over long periods of time, all right, you have two populations that are separated by some sort of barrier, all right, geographical barrier, most of the time. These individuals tend to remain members of the particular species if gene flow is allowed through those species. So, coyotes, they're up north. There were some coyotes east of the Mississippi River, up north area, but with the building of bridges and things like that, coyotes have moved east of the Mississippi, south of where the river is now a big barrier, all right? And so the populations of coyotes in the east get individuals, east of the Mississippi, get individuals from the west of the Mississippi, and so they intermix. And so those interaction, that gene flow, allows for those two populations to remain the same species, all right? Because there's alleles moving into and out of those two gene pools. But if gene flow is prevented, for instance, they cannot get past the Mississippi River, then the population of the western coyote and the eastern coyote, those gene pools start to get changes in them because there's natural selection, mutation, non-random mating, genetic drift, all working on those gene pools, all right? And so if that happens, you have this thing called genetic divergence occurring in the gene pools. So you get this differences in the gene pools. Well, over long periods of time, if we do not allow the eastern and western coyotes to mix, then over a long period of time, genetic divergence occurring in the gene pools, and at some point in time, each of those populations will become reproductively isolated. And when reproductive isolation occurs, then you have two new species, because if you took a western coyote and you mated it with an eastern coyote, they would get a pup, but that pup would not be viable. It would not be fertile. It would be sterile. So it could not have a mixed east or west puppy of its own. All right. So that's the way most species are formed. Right. There's this long period of time. You have gene flow prevented. Once you have gene flow prevented, then each of the gene pools from each of the populations get mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, all working on them independently and causing divergence. And once you have divergence occur at a certain amount of time, reproductive isolation occurs, and this causes each population then to be their own separate species. So there are geographical barriers, but there are also reproductive barriers. Geographical would be mountain ranges, oceans, etc. But there are reproductive barriers as well that prevent gene flow from occurring between populations. And these reproductive barriers can be either pre-zygotic, that means pre means before, zygotic means the formation of the zygote, so before fertilization, and then post-zygotic barriers. These are formed after fertilization has occurred, right? So, pre-zygotic barriers, barriers that prevent mating or fertilization between two different species, two populations, okay? First is temporal isolation. This is where two species breed at different times. Cicadas, you know, those things go bzz, 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 like that during the summer, all right? There are some that are going to be found every year, right? But there are some called periodic cicadas that live in the ground and only come out to mate every either 13 years or in another species only 17 years, right? These periodic cicadas are hardly ever around at the same time, so they don't reproduce with each other, right? Because they're not there at the same time. So that's temporal isolation. Habitat isolation is where you have two species that live in the same general area, but not in the same kinds of places. If you were to look at a reptile field guide, there are a western garter snake that lives in Arizona. There are two species. They look fairly similarly, but there's some differences. But one lives in the ravines, all right, down where the water would be during rainfall. And then there are some that live on the highlands, upland, all right. These two species, if you were to look at their general distribution, they live in the same place. They live in Arizona, in the same places in Arizona. However, they don't use the same habitats. And so they very rarely come in contact with each other. And so this kind of keeps them from mating, all right? And this is called habitat isolation. Behavioral isolation is when there's little or no sexual attraction between females and males of different species. For instance, there are large birds called cranes. There are two species. There's the sandhill crane and the whooping crane. They mate and they lay their eggs in the same areas, all right? During courtship, they do this big dance, all right? They wave their wings and they use their head, cock it back like this, and they jump up and down, all right? I didn't do them justice. But each of their courtship dances are just a little bit different, all right? And the females looking on at these males are not seeing the same thing. If they see one that they recognize as their particular courtship dance, that's what they're attracted to. The other one is attracted to the other dance, all right? And so this behavioral difference makes the females attracted to those that they recognize as their own species, right? So this kind of prevents mating between species that are different, or would prevent gene flow between two populations of the same species if they didn't recognize this. Mechanical isolation is where the body parts, the reproductive body parts are not comparable of different species. One that they use is sagebrush out west. There's one sagebrush and another sagebrush species that live in the same area, but one has a larger flower than the other, and so one attracts pollinators of certain pollinators, and the other smaller flower has different pollinators that it uses. And so there's hardly ever dispersal of the pollen between the two different species because they have different pollinators who like the different sized flower, right? So that's mechanical isolation. The last is gametic isolation. This is where if there is mating, between different species, there's no fertilization occurring. So this is sort of like if you had a dog and a coyote mate, all right, sometimes that does take, but most of the time it doesn't because they're two different species, all right? So that's gametic isolation. So those are the pre-zygotic barriers. Some post-zygotic barriers that prevent development of fertile adults. There are three of them. One's hybrid inviability. This is where hybrids, which are the cross between two different species, the zygotes fail to develop, or the hybrids fail to reach sexual maturity if they are produced. And the example of this is Rana. Rana is the genus for most of the water frogs around Kentucky. The bullfrog, the green frog, the crawfish frog, the wood frog, the leopard frog, the pickerel frog, all these, all right, are the same genus. So they're very closely related, right? However, and during the early spring, when there's little wet spots in the woods, all the frogs from all these different species come together and lay their eggs in these little pools. So at the same time, you could have bullfrogs and green frogs and wood frogs all at the same little pool, and as they lay their eggs, then the males milk those eggs. They release sperm. Those sperms swim to the eggs and fertilize them, right? If they're all together, jam-packed together, sometimes the sperm from one male of a species goes and swims and fertilizes the egg of another species that's releasing their eggs at the same time. And what happens is that then the hybrid that is being produced most of the time just doesn't develop, right? Sometimes it does, and those individuals are pretty weak and they don't live very long, right? So this is called hybrid inviability. Hybrid sterility is the one that we're most common with, most common and we're most familiar with. This is where a hybrid is produced, all right, between the two species, but that hybrid is sterile, all right? It doesn't have functional gametes, right? It does not produce functional gametes. So our example here is a mule, right? A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. The resulting mule is sterile. You can't make more mules out of mules. Even though they're male mules and female mules, Jakes and Jennies, they still can't produce other mules. In order to get another mule, you have to mate a donkey with a horse, right? So that's hybrid sterility. Hybrid breakdown is where the offspring of hybrids, all right, so the hybrids actually make offspring, but those most of the time do not produce. They fail to develop, all right? And this is called hybrid breakdown, and they're apparently two different species of cotton that can, if they're hybridized, those hybrids can produce offspring. Those offspring don't develop and are weak and die, right? So that tends to be on the barrier there of what is a biological species and what's not. Sometimes this speciation occurs gradually over time, just like we talked about, where in the absence of gene flow between two geographically separated populations, daughter species form gradually by divergence, right? Reproductive isolation. We just talked about that. This is called allopatric speciation, and there are these fish called wrasses. They are reef fish. At one time, the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean were not separated by land. The isthmus arose and separated the Atlantic Ocean from the Pacific Ocean in Panama. As a result, the fish, the wrasses in the Atlantic side and the wrasses on the Pacific side could not interact. So since they could not interact, genetic divergence occurred in both gene pools over long periods of time, and now they're reproductively isolated, even though if you look at them, they're very, very similar. Sympatric speciation is where daughter cells arise from a group of individuals within an existing population. So this is where, over long periods of time as well, individuals in the same area just separate themselves into groups of individuals and do not interact with any other individuals from that population. And so there are cichlids. Cichlids are types of fish, freshwater fish, in Lake Tanzania, I think. There are several different species of cichlids that live in that lake. There are different habitats, and within those habitats you will find these different species. So once a group of individuals started using a specific habitat, they isolated themselves from others in that same population, and since they isolated themselves, they did not interact. Gene flow was prevented, and so genetic divergence occurs, and so forth and so on. So this one is sort of a where they choose to separate themselves. The allopatric speciation is where there's some sort of barrier that prevents them from associating with each other. And lastly, there are different types of models of rates of speciation. The gradualistic model is the one that we just talked about, where over long periods of time, if gene flow is prevented, then you have genetic divergence occurring, and then you have reproductive isolation. But to explain some of the things that are in the fossil records, right, where over short periods of time there's a lot of changes and populations that develop, species that develop in short periods of time. This is to help, again, to support the fossil record. So there's a punctuated equilibrium model of speciation as well, where geologically speaking, short periods of time where you have populations changing and in their gene pool, changes in their gene pool, so that changes occur in two different species are formed. So that is chapter 14.